started. My name is Liddiard. I'm the Senior Education Specialist at the Virginia Historical Society. It's kind of a fancy way of saying I'm in charge of all of our distance learning and digital outreach. The Virginia Historical Society has been around since 1831, and what we do is basically collect, preserve, and share the things that make up Virginia history. And to that end, a lot of that is U.S. history, because it all kind of starts here. We have a collection of almost 10 million process things, not to mention hundreds of thousands of things that are waiting for us to get. I am going to focus today on things from our collection and things from our collection that have been digitized, but I'll throw in the caveat that I think it's about 6% of our collection has been digitized, so there's a lot of things out there that we're working hard to get to make it more available to you. But I will say that the things that we identify first are things kind of like our heavy hitters, our treasures, and certainly things that will align with what your teachers might need. Real quickly, I'm going to kind of go through stuff that you've probably heard throughout this conference so far, these ideas of what 21st century skills and all that kind of stuff are, just to make sure we're on the same page about why this would be important. But I want to start with kind of, when it comes to history, what is digital history? Why digital history? Anyone have, when I say the words digital history, what does that make people think of?
Documents have been scanned, electronic, digital.
Yeah, so things have been scanned digitally. So that, you know, if you go to the Library of Congress, right? And, has anyone ever been to the Library of Congress website? It can be pretty daunting sometimes. There's a ton of stuff there. Luckily, I think in the past year they've revamped a lot of that, so it makes it a little bit easier. But on a day like today, where it's kind of gloomy outside and you start searching for something, you can find yourself like 5 hours later, and all of a sudden you're looking at something like 1840 in California. You're like, wow, that's kind of. So I mean, there is a ton of stuff out there. So just the mere existence of historic things that have been digitized. Any other ideas about digital history?
Putting those documents in a format that allows it to be interactive. You know, you can layer maps or interact with the primary document where you could in a physical piece.
Right. So great example is University of Richmond did a Valley of the Shadow project, looking at a bunch of maps and different things, and really that you kind of take some of these sources, puts them in a more easily digestible format for you to look at. It can be the same thing, almost creating an online exhibit. It's something that I've worked with a lot of different school groups where they may find sources and then figure out how do they want to tell their particular story. And that can be, again, text things, it can be images. Digital history can be, I mean, as simple as like Ancestry.com, right? People going through and trying to find their genealogy. And so there's lots of examples of this that are out there. I just kind of wanted to touch on that, today we'll probably talk mostly about some of these first things, but there are lots of people who are involved in digitizing this. Because one of the big concerns is paper ends up dying, right? And things on videotape or any kind of tape, discs start. And so how are we going to save these things? Now here's the part that I'm sure that you guys have heard a lot about, either this week, these past couple days, or just in general since it became the 21st century, right? What these skills are. Creativity, innovation, critical thinking, problem solving. The reason I wanted to bring these skills up is a lot of times when these skills are mentioned, they talk about them in conjunction with STEM, sometimes with language arts. The first place you think of with 21st century skills isn't always social studies or history, for a good reason, because they sometimes seem diametrically opposed. But I do want to look at this quote for a second. I do not care to have my pupils learn dates and events, but I'm particularly anxious to have them develop the historic sense. And I think that any of us, and normally when I talk about this, I start out by asking folks to raise your hand if you either love or hate history. And everyone's hand goes up because there aren't a lot of people who are just like, yeah, I'll take it or leave it, right? And it's usually based on your instructor. boil it down even further to whether or not your time with history had to know about names and dates, or if you ended up spending time learning the stories. And I think those of us who end up liking history, if we happen to know names and dates, that's great. But the real reason we like it is because of those stories. This quote was from Dr. J. Carlton Bell, 1917. So, again, probably something that you all have heard throughout this conference. These ideas aren't new. Dr. Bell, working with an education psychologist, tried to develop the 5 aspects of a historic sense. Dr. Bell also ended up being one of the earliest superintendents for Virginia's Department of Education. And so he lists these aspects of the historic sense. I'm not going to read through all of them, but one of the caveats he threw in there is when you get down to number 5, and he lists them in importance. Down to number 5, the ability to answer factual questions about historic personalities and events. He says that's the least important of these aspects, but he also threw in there, almost looking ahead, that's going to be the easiest thing to assess. And that's where we are now. So what does this mean for us? Whether we want to use the word historian in there or not, those are the skills that we want our students to have. Whether it's as a language arts teacher or a math teacher, science teacher, whatever it is, we want our students to know how to analyze, synthesize, make an argument, be able to collaborate, create things. And it does fit with all of these 21st century skills. So how do you do it in a discipline that is focused on looking specifically in the past? And that's where these ideas of digital history come in. So I've brought some examples today that I want to go through and show you all, give some ideas of ways that this can be shared with teachers, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the social studies teacher. I think most of these will apply at least to going cross-curricular into language arts, but some of them into science, into math. And I'm going to try and travel through from this document all the way up until the 20th century, depending on how quickly I can talk. So, if we were in a class, I would ask you all to take a look. Can anyone see? I'll actually give you all a hint. I'll zoom in down here at the bottom. When was this made? 1622. And so it first tried to source these things, right? 1622. And imagine that's almost 400 years ago. Imagine one of the pieces of paper they've given me today. What is that going to look like in 400 years? It's not even going to be around, right? So, I mean, there's already something different about this. This is what's called a broadside. I love using broadside with students because they're not hundreds of year old cursive that are hard to read. So you're already a little bit ahead. Broadsides generally, this one has more words on it than most, but broadsides generally are some of your pithier sources. They kind of get to the point. And what's kind of cool about these, and especially if you can kind of go over where these come from with your students, broadsides aren't supposed to be here. I'm not supposed to have this from 400 years. A broadside today would call a flyer. So you go to Starbucks and somebody is offering music lessons, and somebody else has lost a cat, and somebody else has a band that's doing something. And they put all these things up, and when they make these things and hang them up, they're not coming back and getting them and saving them. They're expecting that somebody at some point is going to throw these away. These aren't made to be saved. But when they are, and you look back, you find out some pretty interesting things about what was going on. And so adding that kind of aspect to your students, you're not supposed to be looking at this. No one intended for you to look at this. Add that little bit of curiosity to it, and things, I think, kind of get started with their interest. And so we said 1622 at the bottom. We could also see this was made in London. If I zoom in here. Now, the folks in London in 1622 weren't exactly kings of brevity when it came to titling things. So this first 6 lines is the title of this document. The inconveniences that have happened to some persons which have transported themselves from England to Virginia without provisions necessary to sustain themselves hath greatly hindered the progress of that noble plantation. And then there's a colon that keeps on. So that's still the first sentence. I'm going to stop there. But what inconveniences are they talking about? What is this? You just scroll down. I mean, what is the body of this thing? Yeah, it's a list. It's not a whole lot different than a grocery list or a Christmas list, right? A shopping list. And it's broken down into 5 different groups: apparel, tools, victuals. You might get your kids, I think, victuals and food. Household implements, and then arms. And you can just by looking, before we even start to read it, all right. So the 2 longest lists are apparel and tools. What does that tell us about what's going on? Where they're going? Place isn't like you. You know, if you tell your students, if I'm sending you to Hawaii, am I going to tell you to pack a parka or a bathing suit? So we see the apparel. There's a difference in apparel. You're going someplace with a different climate. These are the things you need. And that's what this is. It's a list of the supplies that you need to go and survive in what was Jamestown, what is now Virginia. Basically right here where we are. Almost 400 years ago, have this stuff if you want to live. Tools, you can break this down. I mean, it's spelled a little bit differently, but you could take this list, you could go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and you can come up with everything that's on here, whether it be chisels or long saws or whatever. Those things are the same. And by the way, this list is broken down in shillings and kind of the entirety of this list, 20 pounds. How much it costs. So you can get into math, right? Math and economics. How much would that be today? How much do things change over time? What's more expensive? Household implements, of course, you're going to need a pot and a frying pan. There's no Waffle House here. You got to have those things. Your victuals, they break it down: meal, peas, oatmeal, oil, and vinegar. So you have those things.
Is this particular document available?
This is in the Google Hangout. Everything I'm showing you is in the Google Hangout thing, and if for some reason they don't show up, email me, and I'll make sure that you all have this. When you get to the arms there, now of course back then, you're going to expect that people need a weapon, right? We can read what that first thing under arms is.
One armor complete.
So it's one thing to say, I need 7 hammers and a bushel of peas. It's a whole new animal if you tell me, oh, and remember to bring your entire suit of armor. Wait, what am I getting into? Let's go back to this top part here. The inconveniences. What inconveniences are they talking about? Hey, so this is 15 years after Jamestown has started. And so we know they're coming, and they decide to set up Jamestown for reasons that have really nothing to do with living well. They want it, as they set up a wooden fort in the middle of a swamp. They want to be able to dock big boats. They're looking out for the Spanish. There is not good drinking water. They're not used to the climate. They're not used to having to work. There's this whole thing called the starving time. It got a lot of press about a year ago when they found there were human remains being. That's not what the oil and vinegar is for. They were bringing that in. But our clue to what the inconvenience they're really talking about is that 1622. That's the date of the Powhatan massacre or uprising, where about 70% of the English who were here in Virginia were killed. Not what I would call an inconvenience. Like trying to pull into a parking space and someone beats you, that might be inconvenient. 70% of people dying, a little bit more than that. But this is coming from the Virginia Company of London, who is very interested in getting people to come here. That's why they would call it an inconvenience. They don't want to say, hey, by the way, you might die, but still go. Instead, there are some inconveniences, pack these things, and it's almost like the fine print. If you don't pack your armor, don't yell at us when you die. Now that one I think is interesting. Almost everyone knows about Jamestown. But there, besides John Smith, who was only there for 2 years, and kind of this fake romance of Pocahontas, there aren't a lot of names that come out of that. When you talk to people about Virginia history, I mean, that's a name, right? This guy, Big George. People think of George Washington. Most of the time people think of this picture of George Washington. So I was looking at this. It reminded me of something else. If you look at it a little more closely, you remember this picture from this summer? Where Big Joe Biden decides to take a selfie. What if we always had social media?
Oh dear.
And so this is a way to think about how your students might engage with some of these things. And so in this case, we're not looking at President George, we're looking at young George Washington. We're throwing this picture up. It's about half and half where students can recognize who this is, which is kind of wild given the fact that everybody around the world will recognize him in the first one, right? Mostly I think it's the uniform, although he is younger here. And so with this, although I said that I didn't want to show you all hundreds of year old person, because I know, especially with our students, showing them this is automatically shut off, right? Nobody wants to read this. I don't want to read this, and I get paid to do this kind of thing. But there's a reason why actually looking at the document is important. First of all, it's okay if it's a little bit hard for a minute, especially if we provide a transcript for them to be able to read right afterwards. But there's a story just in the way this looks. So just take, for a second, don't even try to read, just take a second and look at the way this letter is presented. And this is a letter from George Washington. Here's the outside, didn't have envelopes, so it's kind of folded it upwards with who it's going to. But I want to show you this. This is an example of the way George Washington normally writes. And this is just his diary, where theoretically, no one's going to know if you have to X something out. He was very, very intent on presenting himself as a polished, put-together person. So what's this about? Doesn't even look like the same person based on handwriting. Lines are crammed in here together. So in 1749, the French decide that they want to claim the Ohio River. And they do so in kind of a crazy way. I didn't put this on my path, but it's worth showing you. They laid these iron tablets, and they're about the size of the top of this table. They're made of iron, they're engraved, and they lay them on the ground where the tributaries of the Ohio meet. They lay 6 of these down. Let's get beyond the fact that the Indians who are here don't think that you can own land. How many Indians do you think are reading French? Most of the English here aren't reading French. So it's not the best way to go ahead and exert a claim, but they do it. And about 5 years of traders going by and seeing, finally word comes down to Williamsburg, hey, the French are trying to claim this. This is all land that was part of the 1609 Charter. So this is theoretically Virginia's land, as much as someone can claim land and say that it's theirs. So Royal Governor Dinwiddie taps young George, says, hey, why don't you ride out there and tell the French to leave? And eagerly, George Washington does. He rides out and says, hey, get out of here. And they don't. So he rides back, kind of tail between his legs. They say, well, good shot. How about this? We'll actually give you some power, some force. They give him a commission as lieutenant colonel, give him 40 men, also 12 Mingo Indian warriors, some of the Indians who were going to side with the British, ride out there and make them leave. So he rides up about kind of near Unionville, Pennsylvania, or Uniontown. And he engages with this French guy named Jumonville, or Jumonville. and he kills him. Well, they kill him. There's a quick battle. Both sides agree. There was a battle. Jumonville dies. About 11 other French guys die. A bunch of people run away. A bunch of people are taken prisoner. George's response is this letter. It is basically, uh-oh. I mean, we could break down and read the whole thing. He's writing to his boss, who's the commander of the English forces. Basically says, ran into some French guys, killed one, got a bunch prisoner. They're on their way here. Now, he is talking to his boss, so some of the language you can tell this is therefore to acquaint you with the necessity there is for a reinforcement, scribble, 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 which I hope you will detach immediately. This is how put together George writes when he's afraid he's going to die the next day. He doesn't have time to rewrite this. He crams everything in, ships it out, come back me up. So, to tell you the rest of the history lesson, Colonel Fry, who he's saying this to, falls off his horse and dies 2 days before this. Backup never comes. George is, less than a month later, Fort Necessity is taken by the French. He is able to negotiate a peaceful return to Virginia, as long as he signs a document written in French, which he doesn't read, by the way, that basically says that he plotted and assassinated this military leader. And so there are still French folks today who point to that assassination as the beginning of this French and Indian War. Kind of one of these ideas where out of a small, almost misunderstanding, a huge event takes place, right? This is the George that most people recognize. Another just kind of fun thing to do is these 5 pages, they come from the Library of Congress, where his journal is digitized. This is George Washington's description of crossing the Delaware. Have your students read this compared to the iconic painting, where it looks like, I mean, this ice looks like you can take down the Titanic, right? So one of the teachers that worked with us last summer in one of our teacher institutes came up with this template for a Twitter page. And it's in PowerPoint, and so you're able to fully customize this however you want, which is really more fun for the educator than what the students will ever do. So the assignment for the students would be, all right, take this letter and break it down to how would George Washington tweet this out? Just hashtag SOS? But I mean, for us, we can fill, or the students too, you can fill all this in. So I kind of picked the picture of George that made him look like he was kind of posing the most for his Twitter page. I didn't take the time to get the internet going right, but this, I threw one tweet on there, the hashtag Throwback Thursday, hashtag first time's the best time, and that's actually a link to a video from our site that's analyzing the very first map that George made when he was a 17-year-old surveyor. But I mean, you can every one of these things is something where you can fill out. So this is a lesson where students can look at, all right, who's a colonial figure who George Washington may have had. So you can put, Dolly Madison, Martha, James Lafayette, all these different folks in here. Try to break these letters down. So it's having students read a source, synthesize the source, and then recreate something themselves. A lot better than just saying, all right, now Jimmy, will you read the next sentence, and trying to make it through some of that first. In my experience working with some of these sources, there are 2 ways to kind of get students hooked. Either you have a good story or you have a famous name. And if you have a good story, the shorter or more contained it is, the better. So I'm going to show you all 2 sources from 2 of my favorite collections. We have the tiny collections. And so stuff we have from George Washington or stuff we have from some of the big famous names in Virginia. I mean, there are like hundreds of boxes full of paper and stuff we have. You have to be really, really dedicated to want to go through that. This is a letter from a collection that only has 13 letters in it. Before we even take a look at it, just take a look at the page itself. So your students would notice, first of all, okay, this is old. Then when I would ask them, why? How do you know? The coloring, it looks like it's been stained. I say, what do you think stained that? Most of the time they say coffee. Take a look right up here. That's stained. What does that look like? That's somebody's hand. A thumb and the fingers. It has been folded. It has been folded. But that's where somebody's been holding that piece of paper enough times for the oil from their hand to read it. And it has been folded so many times that you can see. Again, not even reading it, just looking at the piece of paper, you can see where it is ripped. And you can see where somebody has tried to scotch tape it, to save it. This is from somebody who you would have never heard of before. But despite not being famous to us, this letter, this piece of paper was so important to somebody that they would read it and reread it, and when it rips, try to save it and read it again, to the point where their own oils from their hand are staining up the page. Now normally I would try to get you all to read this first line with me. This is the very first line that we have written from this guy. And so the exercise here is to find out how much you can find out about a person from one sentence they wrote. Can anyone read the date? May 7th, 1849. What about the date line up there? Where is it being written from? Steam Packet Herman, Ohio River. What's a steam packet Herman? It is a ship. It's a ship. And so he writes, "My dear Sarah, my body is on the beautiful Ohio. My mind is in Rockbridge with you and our boy, and my dreams is on the road to California. So I am pretty well divided. The boat," that's where the blood through the rest. "The boat has the heaviest, but you have the largest portion of me." We can pause and just go, "Oh, what a sweetheart," right? What do we know about this guy? He's married. He's got a kid. He's traveling where? California. Where's he from? He's from Rockbridge. He's in Ohio. So he's from by where that natural bridge is. Gold Rush time. You know that from the date. This guy, 1849, he's from Western. At this point, we still have West Virginia, so basically the middle of the state. He has a young kid. He's got a wife. He leaves him behind to go to California. Is he educated? I mean, 1849 being able to write like this, yeah. Is his wife educated? Either she is or knows someone who is, who will read this to her. Probably her, I mean, you're not going to go over to the neighbor and say, "Will you read it to me again every day," right? So probably she is educated in the one who's reading this. We have a series of 13 letters that John Mabon writes to his wife as he crosses the country and gets to California. He's in St. Louis in mid-June 1849 when that city burns down. That city burned down, and the face you just made. A lot of people don't know that because that fire took out all the printing presses that were there. His account is one of the only ones I've ever found of what actually happens there. He writes about the tug-of-war he has with his animals as they look, and for 500 miles there's no grass. It's like we're feeding our mules biscuits that we make. He talks about a change of identity where he identifies himself, he writes her a letter on the 4th of July. At this point, he's past where there are actual states. He's in the territories. He describes it as being in the wilderness, which he kind of was. And he thinks back to it being the 4th of July. He says that 1 year ago we were celebrating this national day. Today you are in Rockbridge. I am in the wilderness on my road to California. So we see these shifting identities. And from the benefit of hindsight, we know that another 10 years from now, one of those identities, that of being a Virginian, is going to weigh higher than others as they head towards civil war. His account is really great because he actually finds gold. And he finds a lot of gold. And while he's out there, he pretends to be a pauper, pretends to not be able to find anything. Nobody there knows that he's found gold. And he actually writes to her in the last letter we have with 2 words bigger than the others, underlined twice, done well. And he's writing her the day after he found a nugget that at that time was $25,000. Today will be nearly 10 times that much. Really cool story about this is, so most of these things that I have digitized, we end up working through a distance learning program. So I offer programs through video conferencing all over the country. One of John Maven's descendants was Googling him and found it. And I've been talking with him. He's given me additional information. I actually have, I should have put it in here. I have a picture of the big stone that he found that he turned into like a tide pin or something like that. But so he not only makes it, but he actually makes it back, which is kind of a cool story. This letter comes from another really small collection. This one kind of combines the two though. If you look at this, is anything notable on this piece of paper?
Looks like it's written on the back of something.
It is written on the back of something. Who wrote it? Robert E. Lee. So this is one of those Virginia names that people start looking at in awe. Now this is, again, I think it was 14 letters in this collection. Fanny Scott is the woman's name. Poor woman, widow. Why does she have a letter signed by Robert E. Lee? Not just signed by Robert E. Lee. Who's he writing it to? General Joe Hooker. Why in the world would Fanny Scott have this letter? Now, in the Google Plus things, we're not going to take a ton of time with this. All of the materials to go along with this site are part of that. Fanny Scott had a son named Ben. He joined up the Virginia 18th Infantry, I think. He was part of the Battle of Bull Run. He writes her this like 7-page, vivid, almost like minute for minute recount of what that battle is like. So I mean, it's a great source for anyone who's starting to learn, like, all right, these young men who are all looking forward to war, what does it do to them when they actually see it? And he writes it to his mom. The next thing that we have is it is this letter. And there's a whole bundle of things. After Antietam, Fanny doesn't hear from her son. She's like, where's my boy? And she writes to Robert E. Lee. And he writes back. He not only writes back, he writes to the general on the other side, who they're trying to kill each other, saying, hey, let's see if we can find this kid. And this search goes all over the place. It goes to the Surgeon General. It goes to folks who are dealing with prisons, people who have been searching hospitals. This woman searched for her son. Now, eventually, spoiler alert, he died in Antietam. But she never finds that out. She never knows. And she continues this search. So this is dated in '63. She's continuing writing letters up into the collection we have up until 1865, after the war's over. I'm sure she continued the search until afterwards. It was in the 1880s when they finally went through all the muscles to find out that we didn't make it. I guess I should check and see what time it is. This is another one of these broadsides. And this one has a lot less words on it, and it tells a whole lot of stories. Make that a little bit bigger. So. What's the story here? All right, so if we're working with students with this, the first thing we'd say is, all right, well, when was it made, right? 1866. April 2nd, 1866. That tells us it's about a year after Richmond burned. Who's writing it? A committee. Can we tell anything about the committee based on the rest of the... They're African Americans.
Probably all male.
All male. And what is the purpose of creating this? Again, being a broadside had a very short-term purpose. They're not expecting someone 150 years ago or 150 years later to be looking at it, but they're definitely hoping that, so this is going to be up all over the city of Richmond. And there's a reason they're taking the time. So now a yearly freed African Americans in Richmond taking the time and money to craft something, print it out, and put it out all over the city.
They're not going to recognize the anniversary of their creation.
Well, I think they're saying that they're not going to celebrate it as the failure of Southern Confederacy, but they are going to recognize it as the day they were liberated.
Okay, so is there consensus? Is there going to be a celebration?
No. Oh, there's going to be a celebration.
There's going to be a celebration. There's going to be a celebration, but they want everyone to know, hey, we're having a good time, not at your expense, right? Kind of like, so when people in an apartment complex have a party, and they let everyone know, hey, we're having a party, so if there's a problem, come to us before you call the cops. Not going to celebrate the failure of the Southern Confederacy, as has been stated in the papers of the city. Who's controlling the majority of the papers in the city? White folks, former Confederates. They're not going to look at this as any kind of nuanced thing. Well, yeah, there's lots of reasons. No, they're going to say, hey, look out. But instead, on the day which God was pleased to liberate their race. So there's going to be a celebration. We have good reason for it. But we're trying to make sure you know. Not coming up. Not trying to rub it in. Why would they be so concerned about making sure that people know the intent behind their celebration?
Not retaliation.
Worried about retaliation. We have kind of like the proto-KKK that's starting to form during this Reconstruction period. They want to make sure that we can have this celebration without anyone interrupting, without there being violence. Unfortunately, there is violence. Not during the actual celebration, but the night before. So in between this being printed and the actual celebration, I think it was Second Baptist Church, the largest African-American Baptist church in Richmond, was burned. They weren't able to decisively say what it was, but knowing everything going around, we're pretty sure we can draw those lines. So again, very short, very easy to read, but layers of story in there. With things like broadsides, you can take it to the next level, and whether it be through people using their iPads, or even if you just want to use regular construction paper and crayons or whatever, have students create their own broadsides. Is there something, and for even for young students, if they're not familiar with the idea of going into Starbucks and seeing that bulletin board covered, I talk to students about, what is your refrigerator look like? With all of the things that come home from school, and then, so it might be, so it's December 8th now, right? By the end of this week, you'll probably, all the stuff about Halloween will disappear. It's gone. It wasn't made to see 2015. It served its purpose, and it's gone. Unless you save it. And if we save it for another year, and we look back, we might be able to figure out what your school did for Halloween or whatever. So those ideas, they really kind of take hold. Now, we get in the 20th century, there's lots of, again, and I know that I kind of build this as manuscript collection, and there are lots of manuscript things that are out there, but one of the problems that we have to deal with are that students sometimes have a hard time reading. And what can we do for those students that are non-readers? Well, once you get to Civil War and beyond, you have photographs that you can analyze nearly the same way, and with the digitization that's being done, at institutions like mine, Library of Congress, Library of Virginia, you actually are getting details that people just haven't looked at before. So all three of these would allow us to talk about the beginnings of changing transportation. This one's one of my favorites. Anyone from Northern Virginia? This is Route 1. This is what becomes Route 1 at Dumfries. So again, I mean, just trying to analyze this thing, you can tell roughly the time period it is based on, all right, there's an automobile. There are power lines. It's being, I think, 1912. I mean, so with this, analyzing, trying to look at what the story might be, look at the changes, but also just taking it to another level of empathy for what, I mean, what is this guy thinking? It's probably his farm, right? I don't know who this guy is. There's someone in the car. So is it the muckety-muck who has the car, who's just like, all right, bring your horses. I don't care what you're doing. Get me out of here. And there's all kinds of things that we can look at here.
I guess they didn't use their cell phone.
Right. And then these, we're able to tell a really, really poignant story. These are both in Halifax County, 1934. Probably pretty easy to tell which one of these is the African American school versus which one is the white school. And then this is the one that is sure to elicit a reaction. Again, same year, same place. This was an actual bus that was used to transport African American students. So having things like this, and and there are broadsides, there are advertisements, there are lots of things that have been digitized, things that are out there that take this idea of, which is a hard topic to talk about, this idea of segregation, Jim Crow, and it's especially well, maybe it's a little bit easier today than maybe a year ago to talk about, but these ideas become much more concrete when you're able to put an actual piece in front of them. I have other sources that if you guys just want to see stuff that I have on there, but if anyone has questions about any of the stuff I've shown or places to find these things, I'm happy to answer.
Is there I guess some sort of index somewhere where you can find out where these collections are?
The best place to find things that are already grouped by topic is going to be Library of Congress. Unfortunately, the worst place is the Virginia Historical Society's. I mean, we have a lot of stuff on there, but our finding aids and everything need some work. We have them. It's better, but it's not. When you go to the Library of Congress, or if you send some of your teachers to the Library of Congress, they actually have primary source sets that are already designed based on the topic, and they actually have a searchable field where you can type in what state you're from, what grade level you teach, and they have things that will line up with the SOLs that way too.
Is the Virginia Historical Society linked from the Library of Virginia?
No. So the Virginia Historical Society is nonprofit. There are times where we do things with the Library of Virginia, but we're totally separate. Library of Virginia does have some really cool stuff. That's on their on a kind of a separate site, virginiamemory.com. Especially if you're looking at the kind of colonial and Constitution era, and then right around the Civil War. I worked there before coming to the VHS and helped put up some online portals that have a ton of stuff there also.
So something you just join, and there's like a newsletter or something, you know what I'm saying, the Virginia Historical Society?
So the Historical Society, we're talking about trying to form something, especially for educators who are looking for more of these digital sources, but that's still very nebulous. So right now it's the way it works is people look for it and they get frustrated and email me and I help them find it. For the most part, like I said, most of what I do is through our program called History Connects, where I basically curate a digital exhibit and then present a lesson on it, live, interactive. I'm happy to talk about that too, but that would turn into a commercial, and I don't want to do that. Any other questions? Well, if anything comes up, and even if it has nothing to do with this, if your teachers at school are like, hey, I need a source for whatever, I mean, the same thing that I do anytime I talk to kids or teachers. It's great if you remember anything that I say, but if the only thing you take away is that the Virginia Historical Society isn't just a giant stone building for elbow patch guys with pipes who are like writing books, but is an actual institution that is there to help teachers and students. That's the most important part. So whether it be a student who's trying to put together something for National History Day, to a teacher who says, slavery unit's coming up and I have a really hard time teaching that, but there are sources that can help, to whatever. That's what we're here to do. We're in Richmond, on the boulevard right next to the VMFA. Well, right now it's under crazy construction, but it used to have that broken down horse statue in front. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it says your visit, and we're getting ready to plan a trip to a lot of Virginia.
Okay.
But the students are doing a paper related on the topic. That's has to be said.
Sure.
This week.
Thank you.
Absolutely.